So with that, without wasting any time, we are starting the today's topic. Today's topic is IBP, Integrated Business Planning. So in my simple logistics training, in my PP excellence training, I have given some overview about that how the things are going to change. Earlier we were having APO, right? Now from APO we are moving some stuff into the SAP S/4HANA, and some stuff would be moved to IBP, right? Demand planning would be moving to IBP, and then if you talk about PPDS, that's moving into SAP S/4HANA. GATP is moving into SAP S/4HANA. It's now called AATP, and around 2030 APO will go, and then IBP would be the next thing which would be coming up. So we would be having an overview session today, and then in next couple of months we'll have more session in Thursday. Sessions for IBP. We'll try to give you the supply solution overview and demand planning overview. 2 more sessions we'll try to do it in Thursday, free sessions in Thursday evenings in next couple of months. We'll let you know once that is scheduled. IBP is getting slowly increasing. It is there now for quite some long time, but it is now it is getting maturity. Okay, now the demand start coming up for IBP. And I see that there's a huge scope after 2025 for IBP projects when the APO is shutting down and people are more focusing on their planning. So IBP will come in the limelight. So right now it's a new product which is getting maturity. DP, definitely Sam will speak about that, but DP looks like it got quite amount of maturity, and DP has been now started adopted by the multiple clients. Even we also have a lot of requirements for IBP. We need to supply people for Mexico projects. So if you are already trained in IBP, if you know IBP, you're looking for IBP opportunities, please drop your resume to us, support@sastrageek.com. In subject, you can mention IBP. Okay, Bhupender, please send the email ID in the chat, support@sastrageek.com. You can send your CVs. If you already know IBP, we have some immediate requirements for IBP resources. So with that, now let's jump into the deeper of this IBP overview session. I would be introducing Sam. Now, before I jump the gun to Sam, or before I welcome him on the session, let me tell you something about Sam. So me and Sam, we worked together for a long time. Where I was a PP consultant, I was working into the planning also, and he is the APO guru. He's one of the guy who knows the APO in depth the best. So whenever we look for something related to APO, Sam is the guy we were used to approach it. So he is from the industry background. He works into the industries. Then he worked into the basics modules, PP modules also. He has a good hand. He worked for so many years in APO. And then from last few years, he's working on IBP. I think more than 3 to 4 years now, he's working in IBP. He has delivered multiple projects within IBP. So he also now have a good command on IBP. So it's, if somebody need to speak about advanced planning from the depth, comparing the functionalities of APO and what is in IBP, how IBP can change the game for a business, Sam is the best guy for that. That's why we are calling him here. And when I give only the overviews into my sessions, Sam will be taking you into the depth of IBP. Sam, over to you.
Minder, hello everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible, Sam, and thank you for giving your time. I know that we are looking for this session for 2-3 months, and now we are able to onboard you. So thank you for putting out some time and joining us for this session. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, Minder. I'll be sharing my screen now, and we'll be utilizing few PPT slides for this discussion. I hope it's visible now. Let me get into presentation mode.
Yes, it's visible. It's visible.
So you may see multiple slides here. Probably we may not require all those slides to be discussed. If applicable, I will quickly glance through the slide. Some slides I might skip. Along with the slides, I will also try to share my experience of IBP. And if there are any questions, if there are any additions which somebody wants to add in, or any pointers, please feel free. And as Parminder mentioned, yes, I started my career from working into a manufacturing industry. then slowly moved into SAP world, where I started working as a PP consultant, and then a logical transition to APO. So since till 2016 or start of 2017, I was involved into APO projects, and then starting 2017, I moved into IBP. As Parminder mentioned, yes, SAP put a lot of efforts trying to stabilize IBP, try to refine it. We will go through different models of IBP as an overview. I will try to give a brief about those modules as well. But yes, as you might be also agreeing that this is the future now from SAP perspective, wherever for each client who is now looking for a roadmap for transitioning from APO to any other system, IBP is one of the module, right? Which has a very key strengths like integration, SAP background, and user friendly, as we can say. How did IBP start, right? I mean, what was the background? Why SAP thought of IBP as a new tool, apart from the cloud-based advantages? As you might know that although clients started using APO, the primary modules within APO were dedicated demand planning, dedicated supply planning, or detailed scheduling, right? Apart from all those other SCM components. However, there is additional process which is called as sales and operations planning, right? We call it as S&OP. This process was not that, I mean, configurable in IBP, or sorry, in APO, you can say, right? We had individual models within APO, but S&OP as a whole process was not that matured or not that configurable in APO. So most of the clients were using Microsoft Excel's offline tools for doing this S&OP process. And to support that, definitely APO demand planning, APO supply planning, those operational tools were being used, right? So getting that feedback into mind, SAP started thinking that how can we start supporting those clients and help them carrying out this S&OP process using a common tool. And that's how this IBP thought came about, right? So SAP thought that yes, as a next generation tool, let's build it on a cloud-based SaaS background and help clients to use IBP for S&OP process. That's how it started, right? And then eventually SAP started refining the individual modules within IBP, apart other than S&OP. Okay, so I'll go through quick slides. I'll stop on some certain slides where I would like to elaborate. Otherwise, I will skip it. Okay, high level introduction about IBP, which is closely connected with S&OP area, right? The principles of S&OP are being mapped here, which talks about your product review, demand review, supply review, and IR MBR process, which is again integrated reconciliation and management business review. We'll talk about these individual processes in details, but yes, this is what SAP thought of starting IBP as one of the component. Okay. This slide helps us understand what are different components or modules within IBP as a solution within supply chain planning. If you look at the topmost bar, you see supply chain control tower, SCCT. Then sales and operations planning as another horizontal bar. And then within that, you see demand planning, inventory planning, or inventory optimization, you can say, and response and supply as individual sub-objects. What does this mean? This means if I'm a client, I'm only interested to use IBP for S&OP process, for my sales and operations planning. Then I have a dedicated module within IBP. Okay. Within sales, in addition to the sales and operations planning, if I'm also looking for any additional intelligence from the demand planning perspective, we have a demand planning module provided by SAP into IBP tool. If I'm interested in inventory optimization, my safety stock calculations, inventory optimization module can be used. Right? For supply planning, for the tactical or operational planning perspective, from the midterm horizon perspective, we have response and supply. That means individually being a client, I can only have a license for individual module, which is sales and operations planning at a high level. Or in addition, I can also have a license for the individual module of demand planning. So this licensing part is independent, right? That also helps clients to save some cost so that they can only procure or source a dedicated license for their usage perspective. On top of these processes, I would also handle exceptions. I would also review KPIs. So supply chain control tower help us monitoring those KPIs, building those KPIs, reviewing those KPIs in terms of alerts, in terms of collaboration, and help the entire S&OP process, help the individual demand planning process or demand review process or supply review process. So again, as we see supply chain control tower as an individual module here, you can decide to have a dedicated license for it, or you can opt out, right? All this is built on SAP HANA. This is how individual modules of IBP are linked or are defined. Okay, what do we mean by supply and sales and operations planning, and how it is different, or how demand planning module is different than sales and operations planning, which we can elaborate in further slides. I move ahead to the next slides, and I'll stop wherever applicable. Okay. Here, when I'm trying to give you an overview, I will mostly talk about S&OP. Okay. And as Parminder mentioned, when we get into a training courses for individual modules, we will have in-depth discussions on those modules. But let's see how S&OP is built within IBP. Okay. I won't spend much time on S&OP as a process. I'll just take a pause here to see if anybody wants to capture any specific points. Right. But definitely, it's worthwhile discussing the subcomponents within S&OP process. Right. As most of you probably would have planning background. Some of you might have also been part of the S&OP discussions, S&OP review meetings. So as we know that most of the clients have a dedicated S&OP cycle within their organization. Most of the cases you will see it's a monthly cycle, right? It starts on a specific workday and it ends on a specific workday where we align on the consensus demand, and then that gets as an input for your further replenishment planning or supply planning, right? So what are those components where we say that, okay, when I'm starting my S&OP cycle, what do I do as an initial starting point, right? As a specific cadence, let's take an example of monthly S&OP cycle where my S&OP cycle starts on workday -3 and it ends on, let's say, workday 7. So I have around 10 workdays cycle where I initiate my review process on a monthly basis to see if any new materials or new SKUs have been added, which have been added into my portfolio, are correctly set up into the system so that they can be also continued to be involved in demand and supply reviews, right? What are different challenges coming from competitors, any other opportunities and risk that needs to be also considered? Any new product introductions, any phase in, phase out decisions or parameters, whether are they set up correctly so that my product lifecycle management is also taken care. So those are kind of initial product review checkpoints which normally these planners cover during workday -3 to workday 1, right? Making sure that the prerequisite for demand planning and supply planning are set, right? Then the next step is a demand review. Basically, as you would know that, yes, once I have my data set up correctly, right, I would like to generate or predict my demand, a demand in terms of unconstrained forecast. right? So demand review covers different sub processes, which you can start with as, first of all, if I'm generating my statistical forecast, should I review my sales history? That's one of the sub processes within demand review. Once I review my sales history, are there any outliers? How do I manage these outliers? Do I have an manual intervention here, or I use IBP's forecasting techniques to correct these outliers? And then generate statistical forecast probably in the midterm to long term horizon. Review the statistical forecast with using different univariate models to see which forecast is suggested by a best fit model based on the least forecast error, right? That's the KPI for us. And then utilizing that input during the demand review discussion in collaboration with other departments, like getting inputs from sales team, getting inputs from marketing team, finance team, and align on the unconstrained demand, right? There could be additional discussions on events, on opportunities or risk, which will either add up your demand or reduces your demand, right? Those discussions happen as part of demand review. Okay, now I'm sure you might be aware of these processes. How does IBP support this, right? So when we talk about IBP, we have a dedicated folder, you can say, which we call it as a, in APO terms, it is a planning area. So dedicated planning area, which is used for managing S&OP. So as a standard out of box, SAP has already provided certain standard key figures, or you can say opinion lines, which can be used to enter this kind of forecast, enter this kind of demand, or generate this kind of statistical forecast, right? But at the same time, based on your client needs, based on the business processes and your S&OP cycle, you can add additional key figures and inbuild the logic in order to start your demand review and get up to consensus demand step, right? So different sequence can be followed based on the client needs, and that's how, starting from statistical forecast, you will end up finalizing your consensus demand or unconstrained demand in IBP, and that is used as a reference during these demand review discussions, right? So that's how I'm trying to relate the process as well as system usage so that we can link it, right? We can, from IBP perspective, as you know, that we can create key figures which are editable by planners. We can provide, based on their business rules, we can provide access to those planners and have a logic to indicate or prioritize which demand should be considered in subsequent step, right? And that's how the sequence of demand flow up to consensus demand is designed during the IBP implementations. Okay. The ultimate goal for demand planning is alignment on the consensus demand or the unconstrained demand, which will be an input for supply planning. Okay. I try to go to the next slide. Okay. So as we mentioned, the input for supply planning or supply review is nothing but unconstrained forecast. So as we were discussing the different workday cycles, you can say workday 1 to workday 3, demand team focus on finalizing their unconstrained demand. And then on workday 3, the unconstrained demand is released to supply so that the supply algorithm within IBP can run or execute, and it will generate the net requirements and the production or procurement receipts. That's the procurement or production plan. From S&OP perspective, when I'm talking about this demand, the supply calculations, we are talking in terms of time series buckets, time series horizon, right? That means if I compare to APO, when I run my supply engine, it generates purchase requisition or planned order, which has a category assigned to it. It's an order-based planning, right? But within S&OP, we talk about time series planning. It tags these receipt elements to specific key figures, but it doesn't indicate that it has any category like purchase requisition or planned orders. But yes, there are dedicated key figures like production receipts, procurement receipts, which are used for this S&OP purpose. There is a subsequent discussion, probably we'll discuss during the supply planning trainings, that in time series case, if we are saying that it doesn't have an order category assigned, then when we transfer this information to ECC or to S4, how does ECC and S4 understand that this information is related to purchase requisitions, stock transfer requisitions, or planned orders? Because from ECC perspective, we need that information, right? So maybe it's a detailed discussion which we will talk during the supply planning training modules. Okay. Supply planning module within IBP generates the net requirements and procurement and plant proposals, which is reviewed by supply team to understand the constraints, maybe at a finished good level, or if you take an example of pharmaceuticals, at an active ingredient level, right? Which is more, which is a bottleneck for them as it has longer lead times, right? I mean, filling and packaging may not be a constraint here, but finalizing the active ingredient demand can be a constraint, and that is a challenge for most of the pharmaceutical industry. So that discussion happens, that if I have any constraint, if I see any constraint from supply perspective as a result of this supply planning, and yes, if I have a constraint on active ingredients, how do I manage or transform this active ingredient constraint up to a finished good level, so that I can allocate this constraint to a finished good and distribute my demand accordingly, right? So that means whatever demand which demand team has predicted also needs to be discussed with supply team, so that we get a feedback or we have a demand supply balancing to understand my constrained demand, right? That can be also one of the input again for the real supply calculations. Now between workday 4 to let's say workday 6, this supply review happens. This feedback goes back to demand team, and then the final stage of IR MBR is considered, where normally the finance involvement and higher leadership involvement exist, which decides on or probably shifts the demand based on their revenue projections. So if I have a portfolio with different SKUs, different formulations, or active ingredients, how do I, based on my GP calculations or my projections for GP calculations, my revenue projections, how a finance wants to deal with this demand bifurcation, right? And what are the KPIs that needs to be discussed during this demand meeting or during this IR-MBR meeting? Those are also need to be evaluated, right? This is how the input of demand and supply goes to reconciliation review. Those KPIs gets discussed, and I'm pretty sure that if you would have experienced these meetings, right, when it comes to IR-MBR, it's an intense discussion, right, where a demand team has to justify their consensus decisions, a supply team has to justify their make-buy decisions, why there are constraints, if there are any options that needs to be also evaluated to make sure that we don't end up having bottlenecks, and then having this alignment with the leadership team to finalize their IR-MBR process. Okay. This is more of a process perspective. So IR-MBR, you will not see anything from the system usage perspective, but in order to facilitate those discussions, the results of demand output, supply output, alerts, any KPIs which are built up in IBP can be used, right? This is how S&OP process is or can be solutionized within IBP.